Hello and welcome to the Following Truth Bible Study on YouTube. As always, I'm your host, LJ. In this video, we're going to be looking at who wrote the Gospels and looking at the evidence and for the traditional Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and looking basically at the evidence against the traditional authorship, and obviously also the evidence for the traditional authorship, and probably, hopefully, showing that we have a little bit more evidence that for the confidence that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John than what modern scholarship would actually try to assert. So thank you very much for joining me today as we look into the evidence. Just a bit of news. I am hoping to have my discussion with a Hebrew Israelite on the channel within the next 2 weeks. I have somebody lined up and hopefully that's going to happen. And I'm trying to get that arranged, but obviously I shall keep you informed as and when I know more details. Okay, if you are new to the channel, thank you very much for joining. Please subscribe and like the video. It does really help my channel. So let's start with the evidence for the Gospels and do we know who wrote them? So there are 4 Gospels in the Bible: the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of John. Written in almost every single version of the Bible, at the start of these 4 Gospels is the superscription, the Gospel according to, and then obviously Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Now, it has been widely understood throughout church history that the authors of these 4 Gospels were indeed the 4 men that have given their name to the Gospels. However, in recent times, over the last century or so at least, this consensus has changed. Most scholars today do not believe that these 4 Gospels were written by these 4 men. It is now more generally understood that the 4 Gospels were written anonymously and that we do not, in fact, know who wrote them. On a blog entitled "Who Wrote the Gospels and How Do We Know for Sure?", we find the following assertion regarding the authorship of the Gospels. And I shall just share my screen here. And it states, the Bible gives us 4 accounts of Christ's life. Each records a unique perspective of the most significant event in history, the crucifixion and resurrection. All 4 Gospels are named after men who lived during or shortly after Christ's early ministry. Tradition considers these men the authors, but there's one problem. Not one of these books names its author. The Gospels are anonymous. So how do we know who wrote them? And that's on a website, zondervanacademic.com, and you can find that. If you go onto my website, you will see a link to that specific writing and that specific blog where you can read that. Now, in his best-selling book, Jesus Interrupted, Bart Ehrman wrote the following. A further reality is that all the Gospels were written anonymously, and none of the writers claims to be an eyewitness. Names are attached to the titles of the Gospels. The Gospel according to Matthew, But these titles are later additions to the Gospels, provided by editors and scribes to inform readers who the editors thought were the authorities behind the different versions. That the titles are not original to the Gospels themselves should be clear upon some simple reflection. Whoever wrote Matthew did not call it the Gospel according to Matthew. The person who gave it that title are telling you who, in their opinion, wrote it. Authors never titled their books according to. Bart Ehrman, Jesus Interrupted, pages 103 and 104. Now, Bart also makes the claim in another of his books, How Jesus Became God. To begin with, they are not written by eyewitnesses. We call them these books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because they are named after two of Jesus's earthly disciples, Matthew the tax collector and John the beloved disciple, and two of the close companions of other apostles, Mark the secretary of Peter and Luke the traveling companion of Paul. But in fact, the books were written anonymously. The authors never identified themselves, and they circulated for decades before anyone claimed they were written by these people. The first certain attribution of these books to these authors is a century after they were produced. Bart Ehrman, How Jesus Became God, page 90. So, are the Gospels really written anonymously and the titles of the Gospels a later addition, as most scholars like Bart Ehrman would assert? Or were they written by the men that most of Christian history has attributed the Gospels to having been written by? Now, in order to answer this, we must look at the arguments against the traditional authorship of the Gospels and understand just why these modern scholars assert that the Gospels were indeed written anonymously, and then ascertain if those assertions are valid or not. Let's start with the claim that none of the Gospels name their author. When this claim is made, it is important that we understand exactly what is actually being claimed, as it is, in fact, a rather misleading claim. The claim that the Gospels are anonymous is actually specifically in relation to the text of the Gospels themselves. It is argued that nowhere within the text do the authors identify themselves. For example, Matthew does not say, I, Matthew, or I, Matthew, wrote this gospel, or indeed anything similar to identify himself as the writer. And the same is said about the other three gospel writers, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, the reason that this is important to understand just what is being claimed by this assertion is that the Gospels do, in fact, identify who the author is. The superscription, or the title of the Gospel, is found on all of our available manuscripts and reads the Gospel according to, or simply according to, then either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. We do not have, in reality, any manuscripts where the Gospels are actually anonymous. Every single manuscript that we have that contains the title page, and that's important, the start of the Gospel, not where this part of the Gospel is not there, where it's just fragmentary, and we just have a portion of the ending of John, or middle, or the beginning, the middle of Matthew. It's where we have the beginning of the Gospel of either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. In every single manuscript, we have that superscription. So we do not have, in reality, any manuscripts where the Gospels are anonymous. The title page, the start of the title of the Gospel, includes a superscription that titles the individual Gospel in the manner, or does so within this, the manuscript text, regardless of where in the world we have found them. The superscription is actually part of the manuscript. Therefore, we do not have any copies of anonymous Gospels. And I shall just give a couple of examples. So if I add this here, this manuscript here, this is P66, generally dated to around the late 2nd century, early 3rd century. At the top of the page here, if you can, you'll have to either open up this page bigger, or you can go to my website, or there is, you can actually find this manuscript online. And at the top of the page, you will see that it reads in Greek, Evangelion kata Johannian. Now, I may not have pronounced that correctly. It is Greek. I don't speak Greek. But it's in the English, it is Gospel according to John. And we also have P75, which is also dated to the 2nd century or early 3rd century. And again, we have the superscription that reads Gospel according to John, obviously in the Greek. These are the earliest manuscripts that contain the beginning of the Gospel of John, and both identified the Gospel as being according to John. There is nothing earlier than these manuscripts that form the witness to the start of the Gospel of John. And so the earliest manuscript witnesses that we have attest to this particular Gospel being the Gospel according to John. Now, both Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, which are dated to the 4th century, the two foremost manuscripts when it comes to modern textual criticism, include the superscription when it comes to these Gospels, the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John at the beginning of each of the Gospels. So the two manuscripts that carry the most authority and are considered the best witnesses to the original text by modern textual critics attest to the Gospels having been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this is what we find in every single manuscript that we have available today that contains the start of these 4 Gospels. When it comes to our available manuscript evidence, the Gospels are in no way anonymous. Now, at this point, I must make note that despite the claims of the likes of Bart Ehrman, the only variety in titles that we have are between Gospel according to, and then the name, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or simply according to, and then the name of the evangelist. So we have Evangelion kata, and then we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or we simply just have kata, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. The latter, the shorter version, is found only in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Now, obviously, it must be noted that for purposes of being honest and upfront, and as most people who follow my channel know that I do try to be as honest as I possibly can with the evidence. So I like to present both sides and allow you to decide on what you feel that evidence falls down on and what side. This argument against the anonymity of the Gospels, based on the witnesses of the title included within the Gospels, is not as strong as it might sound. While we do not have any anonymous Gospels, when it comes to the manuscript evidence, the manuscripts that we have are all relatively late in comparison to the generally attested dates of authorship. It is argued by most scholars that these superscriptions were added later, and earlier manuscripts would not have contained the title. Now, of course, that is pure assumption, because we don't have any physical manuscript evidence that would support that claim. It is already presumed that the manuscripts are anonymous, and for that claim to actually be valid, because we don't have manuscript evidence that would actually support that claim. It's not based on physical manuscript evidence. Manuscript evidence would actually suggest otherwise. The claim is based rather on the available patristic evidence and the fact that the authors do not directly identify themselves within the text. So the first person to have been a witness and identify all four Gospels having been written by the men whose names the Gospels bear was Irenaeus around the year 180 AD. And he states, Matthew also issued a gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. And that's Irenaeus Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 1. So this is, of course, some 80 to 120 years after the Gospels were generally accepted to have been written. And so it is therefore argued that the Gospels circulated anonymously for the first century or so before the names were then assigned to them. Again, this is obviously assumption, and it's an argument from silence. There are, in reality, a number of issues with this assertion. Firstly, we have much earlier attestation specifically to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark being referred to as the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Papias, who was an early church father who wrote in the early 2nd century, he stated, this actually comes from the writings of Eusebius. So it's Papias's writings are brought to us and they're recorded in Eusebius, who quotes them. And he states, Papias gives also in his own work other accounts of the words of the Lord on the authority of Aristion, who was mentioned above, and traditions as handed down by the presbyter John. This also is the presbyter, said Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him. But afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses. Bear with me 1 second. so that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. These things are related by Papias concerning Mark. But concerning Matthew, he writes as follows. So then, Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. And the same writer uses testimonies from the first epistle of John, and from that of Peter likewise. And he relates another story of a woman who was accused of many sins before the Lord, which is contained in the Gospel according to the Hebrews. These things we have thought it necessary to observe in addition to what has been already stated. That's Eusebius Church History 3, chapter 39. So we see that the evidence that attests to Matthew and Mark having written the Gospels goes all the way back to the start of the 2nd century, back to Papias. That's just 30 to 60 years after the generally accepted dates of authorship of these Gospels. This witness to the authorship of Matthew and Mark is extremely early. In reality, we don't have much in the way of earlier church father writings. Therefore, we do not have much in the way of early church writers that can be used to support the Gospels, specifically in relation to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, having not been attributed to Matthew and Mark. The only attestation that we have that goes all the way back to the very early part of the 2nd century says that Matthew and Mark wrote their Gospels. Now, Papias was described as being a hearer of John, the disciple. He was a companion of Polycarp, who was himself a disciple of John the disciple. Of course, John would have been a companion of Matthew, having both been direct disciples of our Lord Jesus the Christ. We also cannot ignore the witness of Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr doesn't specifically name any of the writers of the Gospels, and so this is used normally to support the claim that at the time of Justin, the Gospels had yet to be attributed to anyone in particular. But obviously we have earlier attestation than Justin Martyr. We have Papias. But Justin does explicitly tell us that the Gospels were written by apostles and composed by them. And he states in the first apology in chapter 66, for the apostles in the memoirs composed by them, which are called Gospels. So Justin Martyr calls them the memoirs of the apostles, and he calls them Gospels. Now, Justin wrote his apology around about 155 AD. So this again is 2nd century attestation. It's 2nd century evidence. Whether or not Justin knew the Gospels were written specifically by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is debatable. A lack of attributing the Gospels to those men does not necessitate that he was not aware of the Gospels, the authors. But what is clear is that Justin did at least attribute them to apostles, not some random person that history knows nothing of. He believed that they were apostles. So we do have others that attest to the authorship of the Gospels, and I shall just cite a couple. So we have Tertullian. I lay it down to begin with that the documents of the Gospels have the apostles for their authors, and that this task of promulgating the Gospels was imposed upon them by the Lord himself. In short, from among the apostles, John and Matthew implant us the faith, while the apostolic men, Luke and Mark, reaffirm it. Now, Tertullian was writing towards the, that's against Marcion. And so that's at the end of the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century. And we also have Clement of Alexandria. Mark, the follower of Peter, while Peter was publicly preaching the gospel at Rome in the presence of some of Caesar's knights and uttering many testimonies about Christ, on their asking him to let them have a record of the things that that had been said, wrote the gospel that is called the Gospel of Mark, from the things said by Peter, just as Luke is recognized as the pen that wrote the Acts of the Apostles and the translator of the letter of Paul to the Hebrews. So that's Clement of Alexandria writing towards the end of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd century. So manuscript evidence and church history attests to the authorship of the Gospels having not been anonymous at all, but rather the Gospels having been written precisely by those men that have given their names to them. It is also of great importance that there is no rival tradition that claims that the Gospels were written by any other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So no rival tradition from anywhere in the Christian world, no blank manuscripts, and no manuscripts with any other name. Not so anonymous, I think. So basically, what that means is that all of our manuscripts that we have attest to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are no other manuscripts that attest to anybody else. No church writer attests to, or early church writer attests to these Gospels having been written by anybody else. So the claim that they are anonymous is not based on actual physical evidence. But what about the claim by Bart Ehrman that we saw earlier, that authors never title their books according to, or kata? Now, Martin Hengel addresses this point in his book, Studies in the Gospel of Mark. And he states, the striking form of the title was used to express the fact that here the Gospels were narrated in the particular version of the evangelist in question. And that's on page 65 of his book. Now, if Hengel is correct, then the title simply denotes from whose viewpoint the gospel is being told. So it is one gospel, and the specific title that we have basically attests to who is telling that gospel, basically. So uniformed attribution of the Gospels. If the Gospels had truly circulated anonymously, as is claimed, and were only later attributed to the traditionally understood authors, then we must ask the question, how did everyone agree on who the authors were? We have attestation from different areas of the early church that attribute these Gospels to these four men. The Gospels are never attributed to anyone other than the four traditional authors. If it was only later that they were given these names, it is almost impossible that they would not have been attributed to others in different locales. Obviously, there were four Gospels, and so if all four were anonymous, they would have needed to have been distinguished from each other. And so if the idea was to give these Gospels credibility by attaching names to them, then it is implausible to believe that each Gospel was attributed with their specific name, and this name was consistent and uniformed regardless of the location that the attribution came from. Tertullian was in Carthage, Clement was in Alexandria, Papias was in Hierapolis, modern-day Turkey, and Irenaeus was in France. This was before, obviously, the time of the internet, where communication was much slower. Yet all those that attest to the names of the authors agree on those names, and to which particular gospel each name was to be attributed to. So we don't find the gospel according to Matthew on the Gospel of John, for instance. The Gospel of Matthew is always attributed on the gospel according to Matthew. Now, this is throughout all corners of the Roman Empire. What you would expect is that from different scribes from different locations would have attributed the Gospels to different people. And this is not what we have. There are no other attributions to the Gospels having been written by anyone but those four men. And if they were truly anonymous, it is very unlikely, in fact, I would assert that it was impossible, that all areas of the Christian world would have so readily agreed on the names for these four books without there having been any discussion about which names should have been attributed to the Gospel. Most certainly in the case of the Gospels of Mark and Luke. But what we would have to accept in the understanding of anonymous Gospels is that someone made up this tradition, and everyone, everywhere, somehow all agreed to call these books by these names, and it wasn't even questioned. And nobody attributed them to anybody else. One thing we know is that there were many, many disputes in the early church. They disagreed on many different things, and there were councils and discussions and writings between people when it came to different disagreements. Yet, when it comes to the names of the Gospels, we don't have any of this. There is no contest. The book of Hebrews, for example, which is an anonymous book, has been accredited to a number of different people, including Paul, Luke, and even Titus. This is what we get when a book is anonymous. When it comes to the Gospels, as already noted, there is no rival tradition on the authorship of these Gospels. We do not have any manuscripts or written witnesses that attribute the Gospels to anyone else. We also find no early church fathers debating the authorship or questioning the authorship of these Gospels. Now, there was a debate in the 5th century about the authorship of the Gospels between Faustus and Augustine, as recorded in the works of Augustine. Now, Faustus was not a Christian. He was a Manichaean bishop. This was not a Christian debate. In his 33rd book of his work Contra Faustus, Augustus addresses the claims of Faustus that the Gospels were not written by those men that it was believed had written them. However, even within this argument, Faustus only argues that the Gospels were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He does not name anyone else as the authors. He doesn't give a rival tradition or a rival possibility of who the Gospels were written by. All he argues is that they weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And again, I state, this is not a Christian argument. This is coming from extra Christian writers. Faustus was not Christian. Augustine states, "You are so hardened in your errors against the testimonies of Scripture that nothing can be made of you. For whenever anything is quoted against you, you have the boldness to say that it is written not by the apostle, but by some pretender under his name." Now, Augustine then argues that if we doubt the authorship of the Gospels, then how could we be sure of the authorship of any book? How can we be sure of the authorship of any book if we doubt the apostolic origin of these books, which are attributed to the apostles by the church, which the apostles themselves founded? Then Augustine outlines the way in which we do know the authorship of particular books, and he uses the likes of Plato and Aristotle as examples. Why does no one doubt the genuineness of the books attributed to Hippocrates? Because there is a succession of testimonies to the books from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to have any doubt on the subject. How do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers? But by the unbroken chain of evidence. So also the numerous commentaries on the ecclesiastical books, which have no canonical authority, and yet show a desire of usefulness and a spirit of inquiry. How is the authorship ascertained in each case, except by the author's having brought his work into public notice as much as possible in his own lifetime, and by the transmission of the information from one to another in continuous order? The belief becoming more certain as it becomes more general, up to our own days, so that when we are questioned as to the authorship of any book, we have no difficulty in answering. And that's Augustine contra Faustum. So the basic argument is that we know the authorship of a particular piece of work through a consistent and unbroken line of attestation. If that unbroken line of attestation for the authorship of the Gospels is in doubt, then this would surely bring into doubt the authorship of every book and works from antiquity. It is because of that unbroken line of attestation that we still know that Plato was the author of his works. We know that Plato wrote those works even today because of that unbroken line of attestation. And this fact that we know that Plato wrote the works of Plato, that is, in fact, evidence against the argument that the Gospels are anonymous, because the authors do not identify themselves within the text. Plato never mentions himself within his works, and yet we know that Plato wrote the works of Plato. This is actually found in many historical writings. Many more examples could be cited, although I will just present a couple, because I think that is sufficient to demonstrate the fact. Plutarch, who wrote 50 biographies, never once mentions himself, yet we do not doubt the authorship of his works. Clement of Rome is another that never mentions himself in his own writings. Now, I'm going to cite Richard Bauckham. He stated in a book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, on page 300. All four Gospels are anonymous in the formal sense that the author's name does not appear in the text of the work itself, only in the title. But this does not mean that they were intentionally anonymous. Many ancient works were anonymous in the same formal sense, and the name may not even appear in the surviving title of the work. For example, this is true of Lucian's Life of Demonax, which as a bios, an ancient biography, is generally comparable with the Gospels. Yet Lucian speaks throughout in the first person and obviously expects his readers to know who he is. On the anonymity works of history, E.P. Sanders states, more important, the claim of an anonymous history was higher than that of a named work. In the ancient world, an anonymous book, rather like an encyclopedia article today, implicitly claimed complete knowledge and reliability. It would have reduced the impact of the Gospel of Matthew had the author written, "This is my version," instead of "This is what Jesus said and did." And that's in the historical figure of Jesus, page 66. E.P. Sanders did believe that the Gospels were originally written anonymously. I must state that. Richard Bauckham further stated, such works would often have been circulated in the first instance among friends or acquaintances of the author, who would know who was the oral context in which the work was first read. Knowledge of authorship would be passed on when copies were made for other readers, and the name would be noted with a brief title on the outside of the scroll or on a label affixed to the scroll. And that's also on page 300 of his Jesus and the Eyewitness book. For the Gospels to have been anonymous, then these works would have had to have been written anonymously, presented anonymously, and passed on with the author remaining anonymous. And here I feel that I need to quote Bauckham again. In denying that the Gospels were originally anonymous, our intention is to deny that they were first presented as works without authors. Now, as the Gospel of Luke is written with a dedication to Theophilus, it is highly improbable that that book would have been presented and then distributed without the author having been known. It would therefore have been believed that the early church would have accepted as authoritative scripture writings that the church had no idea who had written them. These books would have therefore had been written anonymously, passed on to others without the others knowing who had written them, copied down by others who did not know who the authors of these books were, and then cited as scripture by the church writers who did not know who wrote them. And I find that highly implausible and improbable that early church writers would have used these Gospels without knowing who wrote them and who were the authors. Now, while I do not believe that the Gospels ever were anonymous, even if we did take the viewpoint that the original writings did not include titles, and these titles were added later, it is unreasonable to believe that the authors of the Gospels were unknown and the titles arbitrarily added by the church. In order for the church to have accepted them as scripture, it is far more likely that the church would have received these untitled Gospels and would have known exactly who had written them, even if that was just in an oral form, and then they passed that down. Maybe these titles were added later, but the titles of the Gospels were maybe added later in written form, but there's no way that these Gospels would have passed down for the first 30, 60, 80, 100 years without anybody knowing who wrote them and then just accepted as scripture. This is obviously purely hypothetical reasoning if the Gospels were anonymous, which I don't believe that they were. Now, there's also the argument that it would have been beneficial for the church to name the apostles as the authors in order to give them credibility. The attribution of the authorship of the Gospels to the disciples and those connected to the disciples of Jesus is often a claim made by those that assert the anonymity of the Gospels. This would give the Gospels a false authority. And it is, unsurprisingly, a claim made by Bart Ehrman in his book, How Jesus Became God. There's not much mystery about why later Christians would want to claim that the authors were in fact companions of Jesus, or at least connected with apostles. That claim provided much needed authority for these accounts for people wanting to know what Jesus was really like. And that's on page 90 of his book. The claim is likely a true claim. If the Gospels really were anonymous, this of course presupposes that the Gospels were anonymous, and so is a circular argument. However, this claim may hold some reasoned validity when it comes to the Gospels of Matthew and John, both being disciples of Jesus, if of course the Gospels were written anonymously. But this argument doesn't really make any sense when it comes to the Gospels of Mark and Luke. Neither Mark or Luke were disciples of Jesus, and in fact, neither were real eyewitnesses to Jesus. There is simply no plausible reason to attribute the authorship of the Gospels to Mark and Luke if credibility for the Gospels was what was truly being sought by the early church. It would have made more sense and would have gained more credibility to have attributed these two Gospels to men such as Bartholomew, James, Thomas, Andrew, Philip. In fact, seeing that Mark was understood to have been the writer of the memoirs of Peter, it would have made much more logical sense and given much more credibility to have just simply attributed the Gospel of Mark to Peter and call it the Gospel of Peter. What about third-person references in the Gospel? Another common objection to the authorship of the Gospels being that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John is third-person references of the supposed authors within the Gospels themselves. Matthew is named in the third person in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 9:9. And as Jesus passed forth from thence, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom. And he saith unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him. And it is generally believed that the Gospel, that John is the disciple that Jesus loved most. In the Gospel of John, the author refers to the disciple who Jesus loved in the third person. John 13:22. Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. So we have third person references in Matthew and John. It should be no surprise that Bart Ehrman himself makes specific reference to this. Moreover, Matthew's Gospel is written completely in the third person about what they, Jesus and the disciples, were doing, never about what we, Jesus and the rest of us, were doing. Even when this Gospel narrates the event of Matthew being called to become a disciple, it talks about him, not about me. read the account for yourself, Matthew 9:9, which we just did. There's not a thing in that would make you suspect the author is talking about himself. That's, again, Jesus Interrupted, page 104. However, this again really is no objection at all. It was certainly not uncommon for writers to refer to themselves in the third person within their own works. This is simply called Iliism, and it is actually not uncommon for writers to make use of this. And again, I shall just give a couple of examples. The Greek historian Thucydides referenced himself in the third person numerous times in his work. The Peloponnesian War, or Peloponnesian War. I shall just quote the start of the work where he does that. Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, beginning at the moment that it broke out. And that's in chapter 1. So he refers to himself as in the third person. And I can give many, many, many examples of Josephus referring to himself in the third person on numerous occasions in his writings. Now, I'm not going to read all of these out. You can look on my website, or you can read Josephus, specifically in the War of the Jews. So I shall just scroll there. He refers to himself as was Josephus, the son of Matthias. So he's referring to himself in the third person. And he also states, Josephus also, when he had settled these rules for determining causes by the law. So again, a third person reference to himself, but with the consistent consent of Josephus, but for the building of the rest of the fortresses. So Josephus, time and time again, refers to himself. He saw that Josephus was highly pleased. So this is third person references, and there are lots and lots of them, specifically, like I say, in the War of the Jews. If you read that, you will see that Josephus is referring to himself in the third person. But these writings were written by Josephus. Now, of course, these self-references in the third person do not in any way bring the authorship of Josephus into doubt. We also have a third person reference by Xenophon, who was a Greek historian and philosopher, in his writing called Anabasis. And there we go again. There was a man in the army named Xenophon. And so Xenophon is actually referring to himself in the third person. So this is just not an uncommon thing for writers to actually do, to refer to themselves and take themselves out of the story and just insert themselves back in as a person within the story rather than the person telling the story. Again, we do not doubt the authorship of any of these writings based on the third person references. Now, the usage of third person self-references is in no way an argument against the authorship of Josephus or Xenophon. And so, to remain consistent, we should not bring into doubt the authorship of the Gospels. Now, this was actually, again, something that was brought up in the argument between Faustus and Augustine. And it states, thus we read, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom, and he called him, and he immediately rose up and followed him, Matthew 9:9. No one writing of himself would say he saw a man and called him and he followed him, but he saw me and called me, and I followed him. Evidently, this was written not by Matthew himself, but by someone else under his name. Since then, the passage already quoted would not be true even if it had been written by Matthew, since he was not present when Jesus spoke on the Mount. Much more is its falsehood, even evident from the fact that the writer was not Matthew himself, but someone borrowing the names both of Jesus and of Matthew. Now, that again was addressed by Augustine, and Augustine states, Faustus thinks himself wonderfully clever in proving that Matthew was not the writer of his gospel, because when speaking of his own election, he says not, he saw me, and he said to me, follow me, but he saw him and said to him, follow me. This must have been said either in ignorance or from a design to mislead. Faustus can hardly be so ignorant as to not have read or heard that narrators, when speaking of themselves, often use a construction as if speaking of another. It is more profitable that Faustus wished to bewilder those more ignorant than himself, in the hope of getting hold on not a few unacquainted with these things. It is needless to resort to other writings to quote examples of this construction from profane authors for the information of our friends and for the refutation of Faustus. We find examples in passages quoted above from Moses by Faustus himself, without any denial, or rather with the assertion that they were written by Moses, only not written by Christ. When Moses then writes of himself, does he say, I said this, or I did I that, and not rather Moses said, and Moses did? Or does he say, the Lord called me, the Lord said to me, and not rather the Lord called Moses, the Lord said to Moses, and so on? So Matthew 2 speaks of himself in the third person. So this was addressed back during that argument in the 5th century. This was what Bart Ehrman is stating is not anything new. This has been addressed. Now, there is a small objection related to the fact that there are times when the gospel writer includes a piece of information where they themselves would not have been present, as we saw in Faustus's claim back there when he states. Since then, the passage already quoted would not have been true even if it had been written by Matthew, since he was not present when Jesus spoke on the Mount. And this objection is rather a weak objection and is easily answered by the way of usage of other people's testimony. In other words, simply using the witness of a third party. And if we go back to the writings of Eusebius, you'll read that was actually something that he stated. Brant Petrie, in his book, The Case for Christ, specifically addressed this point. He states, history gives us other examples of eyewitnesses that relied on other people's testimony when composing biographies of their own teachers. For example, when writing his account of the death of Socrates, the ancient Greek writer Xenophon, who we've already looked at, who was a disciple of Socrates, used the reports of another disciple named Hermogenes. And you can see Xenophon Apology there. The reason was that Xenophon was not present at the trial and death of Socrates, whereas Hermogenes was, and that's on page 42. So Xenophon simply used what Hermogenes had written. So this isn't something that was new or unheard of, even back in ancient times. And like I said, this was something that Eusebius even called upon, about Matthew utilizing Peter and other writings as the first epistle of John in his own writing. So this is just the claim is just not is not as strong as what it's asserted. Now, if we can, that writing, that Xenophon's writing in the Apology there, that again is available on my website. So the link to this, basically this writing, this study, is available on my website. The link is in the description below in this video, and you can go and you can read what exactly Xenophon wrote, utilizing the writings of Hermogenes, talking about the death and trial of Socrates. So that is the Xenophon Apology there. And you can obviously read all of that for yourself. You can search for that. If you just search on Google for Xenophon Apology, you will be able to find that writing online. If you don't want to buy books and stuff, most of this writings is available online. And obviously, it's all available on my website. All the quotations are taken directly from these books, and you can read those quotations as I've read them, but you can have a look at them online on the website. So, what about the claim by some that Jesus and the disciples were illiterate? Now, this is a common argument against the Gospels, having been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Is how could they have been written by these people if they were in fact illiterate? And surprise, surprise, Bart Ehrman yet again makes this claim on page 90 of his book, How Jesus Became God. There are good reasons for thinking that none of these attributions is right. For one thing, the followers of Jesus, as we learn from the New Testament itself, were uneducated, lower class, Aramaic-speaking Jews from Palestine. These books are not written by people like that. Their authors were highly educated, Greek-speaking Christians of a later generation. Now, as a believer in the inspired Word of God, that the Gospels and the writings of the New Testament and Old Testament are inspired by God, I can simply argue that it would not be impossible for God to inspire the Gospel writers to have written their Gospels, even if they were illiterate. Of course, nothing is impossible for God. So even if they were illiterate, God could have inspired illiterate men to have written those Gospels. However, of course, this is not going to be persuasive to those who do affirm the statement as of like Bart Ehrman. It's not going to convince Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman doesn't believe that the Gospels or the New Testament or the Old Testament was inspired by God. So I shall have to try and argue and from a less faith-based position and give a response to Bart Ehrman's assertions. Let's have a look at Jesus. Jesus was clearly not unskilled, despite not having formal training. In fact, we have clear attestation that Jesus was indeed skilled in Scripture. John 7:15. And the Jews marveled, saying, How knoweth this man letters? How does he know writings? Having never learned. Is that the inspiration of the Holy Spirit? Or is that attestation that Jesus was not as unlearned as what people might presume that he was. And as we know that Jesus could at least read the scriptures, Jesus literally read from the scroll of Isaiah, having been able to find the exact point within that scroll where he would then quote from. Luke 4:17. And there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And he closed the book, and he gave it again to the minister, and sat down. And the eyes of them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. So Jesus was able to take a scroll, find the place where that was written, and then he read it. So Jesus was clearly not illiterate. In the Testament of Levi, now that is a late 1st century or early 2nd century work, it specifically states to teach your children letters and reading unceasingly the law of God. And you can find that Testament of Levi, chapter 13. Again, that's the direct quotation, and you can find that online. You just search for Testament of Levi, and if you go to chapter 13, you will find that specific quote. So even back then, in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, it was being stated to the Jews that they should teach their children letters and to read unceasingly the law of God. So obviously they would have to be able to read their own law. Now, of course, that would be in relation to the Torah, and they were, but it's Jewish people being able to read their own law. But what about the gospel writers? As that is what we are specifically focusing on in this study. What about the gospel writers? Were they illiterate? Let's start with Matthew. Now, Matthew is clearly described as being a tax collector. This would have required him to have been able to write, and as he was working on behalf of the Romans, it is almost certain that he would have been able to write in Greek. And when we go back to Matthew 9:9, and it states, and as Jesus passed forth from thence, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom, and he said unto me, Follow me. Matthew worked for the Romans as a tax collector. And so he would have been able to, almost certainly been able to speak Greek, and undoubtedly he was writing in Greek. Luke, he was a physician, and so clearly educated. And we find that in Colossians 4:14. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. There is no reason to assume that he would not have been able to write. Being a physician, it's almost certain that he was studied and well able to read and write. Now, Mark is understood to have been the traveling companion of Peter. And as already seen, it is Mark that is understood to have written the gospel. Mark was the secretary of Peter, as Bart Ehrman himself specifically states. Mark, the secretary of Peter. How Jesus Became God, page 90. It is therefore extremely unlikely that Mark was an uneducated, illiterate, lower-class Jew. Mark wrote the stories and memories of Peter that he had heard from Peter's own mouth. So that just leaves us with John. John was a fisherman, but we will address his ability to read and write in just a moment. Now, Bart makes further claims about illiteracy in his book Forged. Bart Ehrman, after laying down the foundations of demonstrating that the vast majority of first century Palestine would have been illiterate, and that Peter was from a backwards Jewish village made up of hand-to-mouth laborers who did not have an education, he states, as a lower-class fisherman, Peter would have started work as a young boy and never attended school. There was, in fact, probably no school there. If there was a school, he probably didn't attend. If he did attend, it would have been in order to receive rudimentary training in how to read Hebrew. But that almost certainly never happened. Peter was an illiterate peasant. Now we need to remember that in a second, because this will help us deal with John, because it's clearly stating, obviously, Peter was a fisherman from a backwards town, would not have been able to speak and learn Greek. He wouldn't have, he would have been illiterate because he was from this backward town and would never have gone to school, never studied, because he, as a fisherman, would have gone to work as a young boy. And Bart continues on in his argument. This should come as no surprise, really, as it turns out there is New Testament evidence about Peter's educational level. According to Acts 4:13, both Peter and his companion John, also a fisherman, this is John who wrote the gospel, were agrammatoi, a Greek word that literally means unlettered, that is, illiterate. Forged, page 73. That is a big, big claim. There are a number of issues that we need to address about the claims of Bart Ehrman. Firstly, Peter did not write any of the Gospels, and so obviously his level of education and literacy does not affect any of them. It would only become an issue when examining the author of 1st and 2nd Peter. But let's look at the claim that Acts 4:13 demonstrates that both Peter and John were, in fact, illiterate, as Bart Ehrman claimed in his book Forged. So let's have a look. Acts 4:13. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them, that they had been with Jesus. That's the claim. As Bart correctly notes, the Greek word used of Peter and John is agrammatoi. However, the usage of the word does not necessitate that Peter and John were both illiterate, as Bart claims it does. The two men were also referred to idiotes, meaning unskilled, amateur, or private. Neither of the two words demand that Peter and John were illiterate. Firstly, while agrammatoi can mean illiteracy, it also has the meaning of being uneducated, specifically in rabbinic teaching. It must be noted that this is the only place in the New Testament where the word is used. It is simply an incorrect assertion that we must automatically understand the usage of agrammatoi here as illiteracy, simply because it can have that meaning. The fact that this is used with idiotes, it is far more likely that the two men were being called unlearned and ignorant in the English. It was in relation to their educational lack of education and lack of skill when it came to being learned in the scriptures, and not in relation to their ability to read and write. They hadn't learned, or it was claimed that they hadn't learned the rabbinic teachings, the scriptures. They hadn't been taught in the rabbinic sense. In fact, the NLT translation actually translates the verse as such. Acts 4:13. The members of the council were amazed when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, for they could see that they were ordinary men with no special training in the scriptures. They also recognized them as men who had been with Jesus. So this wasn't a claim that they were, or an argument against them to say, oh, these two men are illiterate and they can't read or write. This was a claim stating that they didn't know the scriptures. They weren't trained in rabbinic way with the scriptures. The Aramaic Bible in plain English renders this: they did not know the scrolls. Acts 4:13 in the Aramaic Bible in plain English. And when they had heard the discourse of Shimeon and Johanan, that they spoke it openly, they perceived that they did not know the scrolls and that they were uneducated. And they were amazed at them and recognized them that they had lived with Yeshua. Again, this just doesn't assert what Bart Ehrman claims that it does. Secondly, the verse actually states that Peter and John were perceived to be agrammatoi and idiotes. This does not mean that they actually were. This was simply what the others had understood them to have been. Now we must note that despite this initial perception, they then also marveled at them. So even if we were to use Bart's assertion that this is in relation to illiteracy, Peter and John may have at first been understood to have been illiterate and unskilled or amateur men, but this was obviously shown otherwise. And that's even if we just go and we take Bart Ehrman's assertion. But what about Bart's claims that Peter was from a backwards Jewish village made up of hand-to-mouth laborers who did not have an education? Is it at all possible that those from backward Jewish villages could at least speak Greek? Let's go to the Bible and find out. Peter and his brother Andrew were from Bethsaida. John 1:14. Now Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. So Peter was from Bethsaida. Philip was from Bethsaida. Notice the verse states that Philip was from the same town as Peter. Later in the Gospel of John, we find that some Greeks come to Philip asking to see Jesus. John 12:20. And there were certain Greeks among them that came up to worship at the feast. The same came therefore to Philip, which was of Bethsaida of Galilee, and desired him, saying, Sir, we would see Jesus. So, either these Greek people that came to Philip spoke Hebrew or Aramaic, which is almost certainly not the case, or Philip was able to speak Greek. If Philip was able to speak Greek, there is no reason to assume that Peter would not have been able to speak Greek simply based on where he was from, because Philip was from the same place. And if he could speak Greek, then the claim regarding not being able to speak Greek or not being educated because you came from a specific town just simply doesn't actually hold up there. Obviously, that doesn't address Peter's illiteracy capabilities directly, but it certainly dismisses any claim of the lack of Greek or studied based on the town that he was born and raised. It actually likely demonstrates that most people in Israel at the time of Jesus would have been bilingual, especially as they had been occupied by the Greeks and the Romans, who would have also spoken Greek, for over 300 years prior. So if they're being occupied by the Greeks and the Romans, to say that they're not going to be able to speak Greek and Roman is to speak Greek is kind of a strange claim. As most trade would have likely have been done in Greek, it would have been necessity to have been able to speak Greek, regardless of the occupation, including fishermen. And we have many times when the Romans are interacting with the disciples, with Jesus, and with his, with other people, to assume that they wouldn't have been able to speak Greek. How would they have been able to communicate? It's not the Greek, the Romans who were speaking Greek. They weren't learning Hebrew. They were speaking Greek. So Jesus and the disciples often spoke with the non-Israelites, and so it's really an impossible claim that they would not have at least been able to speak Greek. Now, even if John and Peter were illiterate at the time of Acts, there is no way that this would have stopped them from learning to read and write after the death of Jesus. In reference to a very famous rabbi, Rabbi Akiba, D.A. Carson writes, Rabbi Akiba was apparently unlettered until the age of 40, and then became one of the greatest rabbis of his generation. It would not be surprising if some of the leaders of the church, decades after its founding, had devoted themselves to some serious study. And that's on the Gospel according to John, page 74. So obviously, we do not have any historical information that would attest to John or Peter having learned to read or write, if they couldn't before. But it's not beyond the realms of possible. We should not simply dismiss John's illiteracy or literacy level based purely on the fact that he was a fisherman. It is also possible that as part of his role as a fisherman, he would have been able to deal in contracts, receipts, tax work, which would have all required at least some form of literacy. And the likelihood is that he was dealing with people that would have spoken Greek, and so he probably would have spoken Greek himself. But what about the usage of a scribe? We need to look at the possibility that one or more of the gospel writers and the authors of other New Testament books as well employed the use of a scribe, and that they did not themselves actually write the words, but rather they relayed them to a scribe who wrote down what the authors dictated them to write down. Now, this in no way would take away the authorship of the Gospels away from those that relayed that information to the scribe, if the scribe wrote down what the author actually told him to write down. So while they didn't specifically write it themselves, maybe Peter didn't write 1 Peter or 2 Peter, maybe he got a scribe, Mark possibly, to actually write it down for him. Now, let's ask a world-renowned scholar for their opinion on the matter of the usage of scribes. But of course, who are we going to ask? I wouldn't want to be accused of a bias here, so why don't we ask one who has a view contrary to what I am arguing here? How about Bart Ehrman? That would be a good person to ask. He seems like a good person to ask, seeing that he's written so much on this specific subject. In an interview on the Infidel Guy show, his real name is Reginald Finley, Bart Ehrman was specifically asked a question about the possibility of Paul having used a scribe in his writings. And Reginald Finley, the infidel guy, that's what he goes by, what he calls himself. Aren't there some theories that suggest that maybe Paul himself had a scribe that wrote for him? Bart Ehrman replied, every person that wrote epistles in the ancient world dictated them to scribes. That was Bart Ehrman's reply to that question. Paul was in prison for a very long time, and it is possible that he would have had to have used a scribe to write down his words, such as Luke. Let's see what Bart Ehrman says. Throughout most of antiquity, since most people could not write, there were local readers and writers who hired out their services to people who needed to conduct business that required written texts, tax receipts, legal contracts, licenses, personal letters, and the like. And that's on Misquoting Jesus, page 38. So Bart Ehrman claims that throughout antiquity, most people could not write. So they used scribes. They employed scribes to write for them. This is something that Bart Ehrman states. So even in Bart Ehrman's own argument, he can say, well, yeah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are illiterate. But that's not an argument against Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As he states, most people use scribes. And it doesn't mean that they didn't write what they dictated. Bart Ehrman even states about slaves that were taught to read and write for the benefits of the masters. How many could read? Illiteracy was widespread throughout the Roman Empire. At the best of times, maybe 10% of the population was roughly literate, and that 10% would be the leisured classes, upper class people who had the time and money to get an education, and their slaves and servants taught to read for the benefit of such services to their masters. So even the masters may not have been able to read and write, but they just employed people, or they got people to learn how to read and write and then utilize them. So Bart literally answers his own objection to the disciples being able to write the Gospels, if they were in fact illiterate. The employment of scribes to write those that for those that could not, or even simply who did not have the time to do so, was commonplace, as attested by Bart himself. Josephus, who spoke Greek, employed the help of others in order to help him with his Greek. Now, Josephus is one of the foremost Jewish historians that we know of. And yet he states, afterwards, I got leisure at Rome, and when all my materials were prepared for that work, I made use of some persons to assist me in learning the Greek tongue, and by these means I composed the history of the transactions. So Josephus got help to learn Greek. So whether or not John, being a fisherman, was illiterate, it is certainly not beyond the realms of reasoning that he could have employed a scribe who he simply dictated the words to, who then wrote those words down as Jesus dictated. And the fact is, scribes could have been used by any of the New Testament writers. The usage of scribes simply dismantles any objection against Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John based on their being illiterate or not. Now, what about allusions to the authors of the Gospels? Now, it is, well, the Gospels, the writers do not specifically identify themselves in the text. It is possible that the Gospels do not, that they actually do give us clues as to the authors and those behind the stories. Now, I'm not saying this is 100%, but it is possible. When we look at some of the writings, some of the Gospels, what is written, it is possible that we get information given to kind of allow us to know who wrote them. In the Gospel of Mark, which we know from Papias was the stories of Peter told to Mark, we find references to his disciples, Jesus's, his disciples and Peter. Mark 16:7, for example. But go your way, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. Therefore shall ye see him, as he said unto you. Now, obviously, Peter is a disciple. No other disciple is being singled out. So when it states, go tell his disciples and Peter, Peter is a disciple, but yet he's being singled out here for no reason. When we look at the parallel passage in Matthew and Luke, who both tell this exact same story, the reference to Peter is not found. We simply get the reference to the disciples. Matthew 28:7, go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and behold, he goeth before you into Galilee, there shall you see him. And in Luke, we get, and returned from the sepulchre, and told all these things unto the 11 and to all the rest. We don't get any separation between the disciples and Peter. Now, interestingly, in the Gospel of John, while we do get a reference to Peter, we also get a reference to the disciple whom Jesus loved. Obviously Peter is the disciple, and we had a look at the parallel verses there. Yeah, so in the Gospel of John, we get the reference to Peter, but we also get a reference to the disciple who Jesus loved. So we do get in John 22, then she runneth and cometh to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and saith unto them, they have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him. Peter therefore went forth, and the other disciple, and came to the sepulchre. So they ran both together, and the other disciple outrun Peter. So the other disciple is the disciple whom Jesus loved, and came first to the sepulchre. And he stooped down, and looking in, saw the linen clothing lying, yet went he not in. So it is generally accepted that this disciple that Jesus loved is John. The disciple whom Jesus loved is the one who leaned on the bosom of Jesus at the Last Supper. John 13:23. And there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. So the disciple whom Jesus loved is also the disciple that leaned on Jesus at the Last Supper. Now we know that only the 12 disciples were at the Last Supper. Matthew 26:20. Now, when the even was come, he sat down with the 12. The beloved disciple identifies himself as the one. So the beloved disciple identifies himself as the one who wrote the Gospel of John. In the discussion between Peter and Jesus, where we have the reference to the loved disciple and whether or not he should live until Jesus returns, that beloved disciple states that he testifies and wrote the things. And in the evening he cometh with the 12, and as they sat and did eat, Jesus said, Verily I say unto you, one of you which eateth with me shall betray me. And when the hour was come, he sat down with the 12 apostles with him. So we know that there are only 12 disciples in the Last Supper with Jesus. And the writer of the Gospel of John identifies himself as that beloved disciple. John 21:20. Then Peter, turning about, seeth the disciple whom Jesus loved, following which also leaned on his breast at supper. So we get the same person, the disciple whom Jesus loved, who leant on the breast of Jesus at the supper, and said, Lord, which is he that betrayeth thee? Peter, seeing him, saith to Jesus, Lord, and what shall this man do? Jesus saith unto him, If I will tarry, if I will that he tarry till I come, what is it to thee? Follow thou me. Then went this saying abroad among the brethren, that the disciple should not die. Yet Jesus said not unto him, he should not die. But if I will that he tarry till I come, what is it to thee? This is the disciple which testifieth of these things, and wrote these things. And we know that his testimony is true. It is that disciple that claims that he wrote that testimony. So whether or not John is the beloved disciple, what is certain is that the writer of the gospel specifically identifies himself as the disciple that was with Jesus at the Last Supper, is the beloved disciple, and leant on the breast of Jesus. So even if we said that it wasn't John, it is being identified as one of the 12 disciples at a very minimum. Now, there is more perspective from a Petrine point of view in the Gospel of Mark. And another example is found in the story of Jesus cursing the fig tree. Mark 11:12. And on the morrow, when they were come from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree afar off, having leaves, he came, if haply he might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And Jesus answered and said unto it, No man eat fruit of thee hereafter forever. And his disciples heard it. Now, when the disciples saw the tree the next day, in the Gospel of Mark, Peter is singled out. Peter is the one who is recorded as addressing Jesus, but Jesus in return answers them, as in plural, as in the disciples. And in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, calling to remembrance, saith unto him, Master, behold, the fig tree which thou cursest is withered away. And Jesus answering saith unto them, Have faith in God. In the parallel account in Matthew, There is no singling out of Peter. Rather, they marveled, saying, and then Jesus answered them. Now, in the morning, as he returned into the city, he hungered, and when he saw a fig tree in the way, he came to it, and found nothing thereon, but leaves only, and said unto it, Let no fruit grow on thee henceforth forever. And presently the fig tree withered away. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, How soon is the fig tree withered away? Jesus answered and said unto them, Verily I say unto you, if ye had faith, and doubt not, ye shall not only do this which is done to the fig tree, but also if you say to this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, it shall be done. No mention of Peter. In Mark 1:36, Simon Peter again is singled out. And in the morning, rising up a great while before day, he went out and departed into a solitary place, and there prayed. And Simon, who is Simon Peter, and they were with him, and they that were with him followed after him. And when they had found him, they said unto him, All men seek for thee. But in the parallel, in Luke, there is no mention of Peter. And when it was day, he departed and went into a desert place, and the people sought him, and came unto him, and stayed him, that he should not depart from them. And he said unto them, I must preach the kingdom of God. There is no mention of Peter. But there is in the Gospel of Mark. There is also possible allusion to the author of the Gospel of Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, we find obviously that third person reference to Matthew in Matthew 9:9, as we have already demonstrated. And it's, as we see, in the Gospel of Matthew. And as Jesus passed forth from thence, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom. But when we look at the parallel verses in both Mark and Luke both refer to, and as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son. Levi, not Matthew. Levi is the Hebrew name of the tax collector Matthew. Both Mark and Luke refer to Matthew as Levi. It's the same as like Simon Peter. They have two different names, but it's the same person. Levi, Matthew, they're the same person. But in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew states Matthew, whereas the other two refer to Levi. So it's a possible allusion that he's saying, I'm Matthew. And it also must be noted that in Matthew 10, he is noted as being a publican, a tax collector, telones in the Greek. And if we have a look at that, so Matthew 10:1 there, Thomas and Matthew the publican. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the publican, James the son of Alphaeus. But when we look at the parallel in Mark and in Luke again, it's just Matthew. It's just Matthew. He's not referring, there's no elaboration there. But in the Gospel of Matthew, we get Matthew the tax collector, the publican. They're subtle hints. They may be allusions to the Gospel writer. I'm not going to say that it's categorical proof. And I don't think that it would be enough reason to name the Gospel of Matthew as the Gospel of Matthew if it was truly anonymous. I don't think that these pieces of information would be enough to do that. We know that Paul also refers to himself as Paul. rather than the Hebrew name Saul. So we get Paul, who calls himself Paul, rather than that Hebrew name. It's possible that Matthew calls himself Matthew rather than the Hebrew name Levi. Now, the clues in the Gospel of Luke are slightly more complicated, but with a little investigation, we can, in fact, extract them. The author of Luke is also the author of the book of Acts. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but try and stay with me, and it should become more clear. So the author of Luke is also the author of the the book of Acts. At the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, the author addresses the writer, says that this writing is to Theophilus. As we've already actually seen, it seems good to me, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus. At the start of the book of Acts, the author again addresses Theophilus and makes specific reference to his former treatise or book or account, the Greek logon, of all the things that Jesus had begun to do and teach in Acts 1:1. And we see the former treatise that I have made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began to both to do and teach. And in other versions, such as the NIV, in my former book, Theophilus, in my first book, O Theophilus, in the ESV, in the first account I composed, Theophilus, in the NASB. So we have the writer of the book of Acts specifically referring to Theophilus, stating that in my first book, I wrote this. And he's also again writing to Theophilus. So the book of Acts is the second book. The book of Luke is the first. So this is a clear reference to the Gospel of Luke, where the author recorded the things that Jesus did and taught. However, the author they claim to have, whoever the author is, claims to have written both of those books. Now, in the book of Acts, there are a number of passages where the author refers to we. In chapter 16, 6 through 17, we are told of a story about a vision of Paul telling him to go to Macedonia. Now, the author then refers to we who went to Philippi in Macedonia, clearly referring to himself in the story. Acts 16:9, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. There stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. And after he had seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go into Macedonia, assuredly, gathering that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel unto them. Therefore, losing from Troas, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, and the next day to Neapolis, and from thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of the part of Macedonia and a colony. And we were in the city abiding certain days. The author then continues on the reference to we and us. And we see that in verses 13 through 17. So we get we and us. So the author is clearly including himself in that. So the author of Acts was a traveling companion of Paul. The author again uses we in Acts 25 through 16, Acts 21 1 through 18, Acts 27 1 through 28, and Acts 28:16. Acts 28:16 is an important we reference, as it places the author in Rome with Paul at the time that Paul is imprisoned. Acts 28:16. And when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard. But Paul was suffered to dwell by himself with a soldier that kept him. We came to Rome while Paul suffered to dwell by himself with a soldier that kept him. This is important. In Timothy 2, an epistle Paul wrote while in Rome, Paul clearly states that only Luke is with him. 2 Timothy 4:11. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. Now we know that others were in Rome with Paul during his time in Rome, but only Luke remained with him. So as only Luke remained with Paul in Rome, and the author of Acts claims to have been in Rome with Paul, Luke, therefore, must be the one claiming to have written the book of Acts. As Acts and the Gospel of Luke are both written by the same person, Luke must also be claiming to have written the Gospel of Luke. Of the men that had gone to Rome with Paul, there is simply no evidence from manuscripts, history, or internal attestation, internal as in being inside the Bible, that would assert that any of these men other than Luke could have been the gospel writer. Now, taken alone, I do not think that any of the evidence that has been provided is strong enough to categorically prove that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the authors of the Gospels, although I do think that each piece of evidence does stand up to the claims made when dealing with each individual on its own. When we take them all together, though, I do believe that the weight of evidence almost certainly falls on the side of the traditional authorship of the Gospels. Now, you may look at that evidence and you may still come to the conclusion we don't know who the gospel writers are, or there isn't enough evidence. I think that the evidence that I've presented here is enough to be able to at least have a little bit more confidence in the gospel writers, and that the claims that the Gospels were completely anonymous, the evidence for that or for those claims is probably not as strong as what it's probably asserted by these modern scholars, because they're not giving the full evidence. So it is, I suppose, up to anybody who's looking at the evidence to make up their own mind as whether modern scholars are correct in their assertions that these Gospels are anonymous, or whether they actually were written by men that we know the names of, and that we can be confident that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, I hope you have enjoyed this study. I know it has been a long study and is close on to 2 hours. I do appreciate everybody that has watched, that will watch in the future. Please let me know in the comments whether you agree, you disagree, what it is that you disagree with, what it is you agree. If you would like to do that, I'm more than happy to address them. We've had a little bit of comments. There doesn't really seem to be too much in the way of questions or anything for me to actually address. So I think that I shall leave it there. Again, please subscribe and like this video. So subscribe to the channel, like the video. It does help with future videos that I do. Like I say, I do appreciate everybody that stops by. You can now, if you would like to support my work, you can do so through Cash App. It's available. There's a link to it both in the description and at the top of the comments. It's there. You can support the channel if you would like to do so. Any support is appreciated, and it does obviously help me to produce these studies that do in fact take a very long time for me to study. So I do appreciate any help that anybody can give. And I do appreciate just anybody that is willing to take the time to watch one of my videos. It does mean a lot to me every time, and I say it every time at the end of every video, because it's true. I really do appreciate people taking the time to look at my work, whether they agree, whether they disagree. Again, please feel free to leave in the comments, or you can contact me on my website, www.followingtruth.com. There's an email there. You can contact me there and ask me questions. And I do try to answer as much as I possibly can. And then possibly even do studies into those questions and try to expand on my writings. When I get a rebuttal, when I get a pushback, somebody states something that they disagree with, I try to learn. I'm still learning, and I like to try and answer those and add it to my writings. And like I say, all of this is available on my website. So as it's coming up to 2 hours, I am going to again just say thank you very much for watching. And I look forward to seeing you on a future video. Hopefully, as I stated, I will be getting Hebrew Israelite onto the channel sometime within the next 2 weeks. It does mean that I have to go onto their channel and discuss what they want to discuss at sometime in the future. But it's something that I'm trying to work on. Being a heathen, as they would call me, they don't really want to come and discuss the Bible, which is apparently not for me because I am a devil. So it's really difficult to try and get somebody to actually come onto the channel and discuss with me their views and their beliefs, especially somebody that is kind of studied enough and worthwhile having a discussion with, because I don't just want to discuss with any Hebrew Israelite. I need somebody that kind of has a little bit of sway, a little bit of authority, and who knows their own argument in order to be able to kind of look into that. Hopefully that's something that is going to happen in the future. But again, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on my next video.